there on you, and more than happy for you not to have to connect your camera and to just sit there and watch and listen. And we'll give you a shout if we think we have anything for you.
Thank you.
Yeah, so Mr. Allen, we're in your hands.
Thank you, sir. Well, the first witness is Mr. Bedham, who will present his summary of where we've got to, and then we'll come back at the end of the presentation to do his statutory planning analysis. So if I pass it across to him, and I think he's going to need to share the screen and show some bits and pieces possibly to.
Yep. So Mr. Allen, just to confirm, we've got your evidence in chief, and you've got your summary and rebuttal statement, both of which we've both read. So at this stage, is it your intention to go through section 2 summary of evidence that was in your rebuttal summary statement?
Morena koto, everybody. My intention initially was to do a PowerPoint presentation, a brief PowerPoint presentation on some of the high-level components of the plan change, just to refresh everyone's memories following Mr. Allen's legal submissions. So I've got that here. I plan to go through that. But ultimately, in your hands, we had scheduled me to come up again later in the afternoon following our other experts to sort of round everything out. So
okay.
I plan to give the high-level presentation and then be available again in the afternoon for questioning as well.
No, that sounds good to me. Then, yeah, we're go ahead and share your screen, and thank you.
So just to check, can everyone see the PowerPoint presentation? Has that gone to the first slide?
Yeah, we can see it. We can see PowerPoint, yeah, with all the other slides down the left-hand side, not as a presentation as such, if you know what I mean.
Yes. Okay. Bear with me. I'll see if I can fix that. Try again. Okay, we'll try again. Okay. Is that better?
That's it. Yeah, that's it. We see it as a presentation now.
Okay, thank you. So, morena, everybody. My name's David Bedham. I'm the planning expert for Marsden City Limited Partnership.
Sorry, David, just to interrupt. I'm seeing it, but it's a little bit that you've missed a little bit off the top and the bottom of the slide. So is it possible to just refine the sizes a little bit? Because
is that better on the next slide? No cut off?
I think so.
Yep.
No, that's fine.
It's just the first. I think it's just the first slide. So
my apologies. Go back to your.
So look, the intention, as I said, is to give a high-level presentation on the site context and planning context and changes to the provisions. Like I said, I'm scheduled to go up again later this afternoon following our other experts' presentations. But again, I'm happy, if it's more efficient in the Commissioner's eyes, to take questions as I go throughout. So please feel free to interject if you would like to ask a question.
Thank you.
So just to touch on some of the points that Douglas has made with a visual graphic, the context of the site. We have 127 hectares of land, which is about 30 kilometres south of Whangarei City. It's currently the main town centre for the Ruakaka Marsden Point area. It has State Highway 15 to the southwest, and it has the Kiwi Rail Port Marsden Rail Spur designation to the north.
Just to interject there, so you say it's the main town, currently the main town centre. I presume Ruakaka town centre actually operates as the main town centre for people at the moment in terms of level of development.
Yeah, correct. That's just in terms of the Marsden primary centre zoning. So.
Oh, I see. Yeah, sorry.
Yeah. So no, acknowledge the Ruakaka village is to the east as well. So in terms of the zoning context, this map here is the recent appeals version of the urban and services. So it's just to give some context to what Mr. Allen was talking about in his legal submission. So we have Marsden Primary Centre in orange here currently. To the north, we have One Tree Point, which is predominantly residential land use, and then to the east, we have Marsden Point Refinery in Northport. and then we have a large area of industrial land. The Ruakaka shops, for context, are the area of pink. I'm not sure if you can see my cursor, but they're just about a couple of kilometres to the east as well. So, and then to the north, currently you have a large area of rural production zone. So that's the current zoning context. In terms of the site context, we currently have a skeleton roading network that exists on the site. It's largely undeveloped, particularly on the north half, but there is actually some development that start taking off, which I think you would have observed in your site visit back in August. I can confirm that I've been to the site again on the 17th of October and went through another drive-through, and there is development increasing in the south, including a retirement village, gym, some other components as well. But like I said, the majority of the land is undeveloped and largely retained in pasture. So currently, in terms of the planning context, the site is zoned Marsden Primary Centre, and urban development is currently provided for it. So just reinforcing what Mr. Allen said earlier, this is not a greenfield site, it's not a rural production zone, this is already an urban zoned site. In terms of the genesis of the Marsden Primary Centre provisions, they originally arose from the Marsden Point Ruakaka structure plan back in 2008, and a satellite town centre has been shown in this location for the last 10 years, as Mr. Allen identified. But also this is acknowledged as a future development area in the recently adopted growth strategy. So I touched upon that in my rebuttal evidence. Since the August hearing dates were moved, we actually have had the Whangarei growth strategy adopted in mid-September.
Sorry to interrupt there, does the growth strategy identify what type of development in terms of form of development and zonings might be appropriate in that location?
No, it's quite generic. It identifies this area along with the area adjacent to it as a future development area. But there are specific directions in there regarding the Ruakaka structure plan being revisited as a priority. I think scheduled for potentially start of next year or end of this year, but council will probably have to confirm that. So it does replace. Sorry, sorry.
Oh, sorry, Mr. Bedham. On that, is it fair to say that the recently adopted growth strategy is far less detailed and directive than the previous one?
Correct. It's quite high level. My reading of the new growth strategy is that it has approximately 2 or 3 pages on the whole Ruakaka Marsden Point area, whereas the structure plan 3050 was a lot more detailed. Sustainable Futures 3050 is now, as I understand it, obsolete. It is replaced by the recently adopted growth strategy.
Thank you.
And look, just one of the key things to note with the Marsden Primary Centre, and I'm sure anyone who's opened that chapter will identify this, the provisions are overly complex and challenging to interpret and apply. That's sort of borne out in the initial analysis from the applicant as well that led to PC 150. Just in terms of some of the key changes, so, well, as Mr. Allen pointed out, the Marsden Primary Centre provisions were specifically excluded from the overall scope of the urban and services plan changes. So that was specifically included in the notification that they were excluded, and the applicant and other parties couldn't actually seek to include that in the plan changes. That's, in my view, just sort of the nature of a rolling review of a plan. You sort of end up looking at things in a sequential way, not necessarily the most efficient, but it sort of is what it is. The industrial focus and size of the town centre and the analysis of the applicant has led to a slow uptake of development, particularly in the north of the site. And I've just included one of the maps from the Marsden Primary Centre, which indicates some of the areas of land. So just moving on to the proposal to reinforce some of the key elements. One of the key changes is the full deletion of the Marsden Primary Chapter, a removal of the industrial focus, increased residential land use to support the development of a viable and sustainable town centre, the creation of a special purpose Marsden Town Centre zone, and then rezoning the remaining land as a mixture of mixed use, commercial, medium density residential and general residential zones. And then there's also some consequential changes to other chapters which we've discussed this morning, which are the noise and vibration chapter and the urban form and development chapter. So I just thought it would be useful for the commissioners and all parties just to bring up the various versions of the zoning plans, just to step you through what's changed. So this was the original zoning PC 150 as lodged. and you can see that the mixed-use zone was actually applied all the way to the south along to the west along One Tree Point Road, and then the south along State Highway 15. And you also had the area of low-density residential zone and the Bund. There were also originally indicative areas of open space shown, which were removed following the request for information from council. Following from that to the actual notified zoning plan, which is in this slide. So this is what was notified. As you can see, we have the key change being that to the south, the mixed-use zone has been changed to commercial zone. We also have a thin strip of commercial zone in the north, adjacent to the Kiwi Rail designation. We still have the notified version still had the low-density residential zone with the Bund adjacent to it. The next version is PC 150 zoning plan in response to the Section 42A report. So this is as per attached to my evidence in chief on the 3rd of August. Essentially, the key change is that we included a Bund overlay, noise overlay, so slightly changed the approach to the Bund. There's also an error on this plan, which I pick up and address later, which relates to the area of mixed-use zone on One Tree Point. Again, I'm not sure if you can see my cursor, but it's just to the north of the commercial zone, which I address in the later slide.
I wonder, David, if you can just make that point clear by flicking back between this slide and the one before, so that it's apparent where that error is.
Yeah, I've got a slide up here that'll show it. So I just raised it then because that's where the error came up. It was a simple colour code error, but I'll come to that. It's in the next couple of slides. So this is the rebuttal evidence map that we attached, and as Mr. Allen's highlighted, we have rezoned the area. I've called this the J block in a way, to commercial zone from low density residential, and then the central block from low density residential to general residential zone. The error that the two errors that I picked up, as you do when you're reviewing these things prior to a hearing, is as follows. So the first is that if you can see where that line comes up, is we have a crossover of mixed use zone going into general land, which is intended to be zoned general residential zone. It's just an honest error in the map. It's not intended to have split zoning on those sites. It's the sort of width of a pen type error in terms of the line being drawn there. So I picked it up and updated the zoning plan. The second one, which I referenced earlier, is this block of land here. So this was notified as commercial zone, and there was no submission seeking that it be changed, and in the evidence we didn't seek to change it either. It just is the colours was accidentally inadvertently changed. So that just to confirm, that piece of land is intended to be comms and not mixed use zone. So the correct final version of the map that we're presenting is in this slide. So that has the comms zone correctly identified here, and then we've also realigned the mixed use zone along here so it doesn't result in an inverted split zoning for those sites. So this is the current proposed zone map that we're referring to. So moving on to so in the Marsden City precinct, we also have a sub-precinct map. And I've just in here, I've attached the latest version of that to show all the various sub-precincts. So essentially, with the deletion of the low density residential zone, we're now reduced from 7 to 6 sub-precincts, and we have rearranged that in this map to show the precincts. I also note that the zone overlay here has been fixed on the precinct map. So moving to the Marsden Town Centre, should be Marsden City Precinct, ignore town on the bottom of that slide. The precinct applies over and above the underlying zoning. As notified, the provisions largely duplicated rules from the Urban and Service Plan Changes Decision version. And since then we've obviously had the Kāinga Water Consent Order, which Mr. Allen's referred to, and that has settled the provisions for the mixed use zone, medium density residential zone, general residential zone, and the commercial zone. So essentially all the underlying zones that we use in the Marsden City precinct are now settled in terms of provisions. What the precinct now includes and I sent, at the end of last week, I sent through a clean version of those provisions, and what you see is that there are some unique precinct provisions to address specific matters, including the internal roading network, reverse sensitivity, traffic, open space, and landscaping requirements. And also just to note now that sub-precinct B mixed use and sub-precinct C medium density residential are now totally reliant on the underlying zones. There's no special provisions that apply to them in the revised set of provisions. And in the last bullet point here, I've just identified that through the course of doing the Kāinga order deletions, we went from 80 pages to approximately 25 pages. But in the process of doing that, some additional provisions were inadvertently deleted. I addressed these later on in the afternoon. I don't plan to get into detail of them now, but they relate to a couple of the recommendations of Matt Riley for building setbacks and glazing requirements. So I plan to come to that in the afternoon, but I'm also happy to bring that up now if you want me to talk to that.
I'm happy that we do that later, I think.
Okay, thank you. And look, just the next slide, given the changes in my evidence in chief on page, which page was that? On page 8 and 9, I had included a land use breakdown table originally from Tim Heath's evidence. And what I've done here on this slide is I've just updated the numbers based on the zoning change. So you can see that the changes in the commercial zone, which is increased by approximately 7.5 hectares, and then also in the corresponding decrease in residential zone land in the down there. And I've also provided a breakdown of the general residential zone and the medium density residential zone. Again, I'll attach, I've got in the afternoon, I'm planning to read a brief summary statement where I'll attach this table, but this is just to show the nature and the change in the numbers. So another key component of the plan change is the Marsden Town Centre zone. It's a new special purpose zone. It will provide for a more vibrant community heart and vitality than the operative Marsden City provisions. I think a key point to note here as well is that it's substantially decreased in size compared to what's in the Marsden Primary Centre. It's approximately 8.4 hectares in the current version. It has quite a strong urban design focus, so encouraging high quality, well-designed development that reflects the context, and that's seen in provisions which require restricted discretionary activity consent for all buildings and alterations. So that's the design-based controls and consent requirements. And just finally, touching on the consequential changes, as we identified earlier, we've made some consequential changes to the noise and vibration chapter, and that's primarily based on the evidence and update from Peter Ibbotson, the acoustic consultant. And we also have consequential changes to the urban form and development chapter. So just on that final bullet point, I note the discussion we've had earlier. I have briefly read the legal submissions of Sarah Shaw this morning as well, and I understand that there might be some concern about the ability to make those changes to the urban form and development chapter. In my view, I'm looking at it from an architecture of the plan perspective, and I think that those provisions are best included in those chapters. I understand that Ms. Shaw has concluded that the noise and vibration provisions can be changed, but there may be for the urban form and development because it's not deemed operative. So putting that to one side, my view from a planning perspective is that they should be in those chapters from a plan architecture. However, if there's not the ability to do so, then as Mr. Allen highlighted, you could incorporate those in the Marsden City precinct, either as a placeholder into a future plan change if that was deemed necessary. That's just a really high level run through of everything. Plan to give that, and like I said, I plan to come up again this afternoon to go through in more detail, primarily my rebuttal statement and a couple of other points, but I'm happy to take any questions you've got now.
Anything from you, Mr. Moon?
Thank you, that was helpful. I think I'd prefer to save my questions for later rather than diving into the detail now. It was a useful summary to understand how it's changed as it's progressed through the notification and evidence base, so thank you.
Good. I think the only thing from me was, and it does relate to some submissions, how I think it's probably the southern corner of the area that's currently most developed. in terms of the retirement village and things like that, and how those existing developments relate to the proposed provisions in terms of what uses are where. Just sort of looking at the precinct plan, I think a moment ago is the where you divide into the sub precincts. How you sort of relate to that. I wonder whether it might be worth just pulling that page of the PowerPoint up again, if that's okay.
You can do.
Just to be sure, I've sort of orientated myself as well, I think, in terms of the relative location of the retirement village, etc., because all the aerial photographs are quite out of date, aren't they?
They are quite out of date, yes.
So the retirement village is in that bottom D there, and is the extension, there was work taking place to the east of there as well, I think, when we were on site on the other side of that street. Is that part of the retirement village too?
So currently the existing retirement village is in this block here, which is identified as D.
Yeah.
And I understand that there are plans for a stage 2 development on the block adjacent to that. And there have been some earthworks undertaken.
Yeah, that's what we saw.
Yeah, as to the status of that, I wouldn't be able to comment on the consenting. I'm not aware of it. But I understand Mr. Hartley is online and is presenting tomorrow, and he may be able to give you a specific update on that as well.
We'll ask for some details for that. But equally, I seem to remember in terms of along that road that goes up between the two of those site areas, on each corner there, the southern corners, I think there's development, which is probably commercial development from memory. So how does that sit within from your perspective, how does that sit within the general residential zone suggested there?
I think
those two.
Yeah, I think the block that you're referring to may be further up here. Again, I'm not sure if you can see my cursor.
Maybe, yeah.
Yeah. So there is some existing development there. In terms of the existing development, if it's lawfully established, it has existing use rights, and over time that may change. But in terms of its ongoing operation, it's entitled to run if it was lawfully established at the time.
But you don't see those as being an issue for the overall outcomes that you're seeking to achieve for the area?
No, not specifically. And I note that we didn't get any specific submission point on that piece of land. So I don't know if the scope will be able to change that, but no. I'm comfortable that if they are operating a commercial business, and they're entitled to do so if it was lawfully established. Yeah.
Okay, thank you. No, I'll save everything else for later if that's okay. Thank you.
Thank you, sir. The next witness is Mr. Bellingham, dealing with civil engineering. Now, he and I think most of the other witnesses have put together a couple of pages of notes just for a quick summary so that you are reminded what they've said in their evidence. I'm happy for him to read that, or I think his might have some material in it which might be useful putting it on the screen, but I'll leave it with him. And so we can go through, I'm in your hands. If you'd like us to go through the formal, is your name and do you have the following qualifications, or as an introduction for each of the witnesses, or otherwise just take that they've said that out in their evidence and that they are going to confirm that they are who they say they are.
I'm happy for them just to say who they are and that we've read all of that. So yes, Mr. Bellingham's got a short summary, so I think going through that it's always a nice warm up. So let's do that.
Right, and Mr. Bellingham, if you want to put that on the screen, if you think that's going to assist you in its presentation, please do.
Yeah. Okay. Morning, Mr. Chairperson and Commissioner. So Glenn Bellingham here from Raven Associates. Hopefully you can hear me okay.
Yes, thank you.
So like Mr. Allen said, I've just summarised my original evidence. Obviously there's a lot of attachments and it was quite a detailed assessment first up. So I've just tried to pull out the main points, and I'll just share my screen. I'll talk through it, and a lot of the discussion was just to incorporate those changes that came out of the 42A report. So change in the zoning in the northeastern corner. Let me just pull this one up. So just let me know if you can see this okay.
Yeah.
So just the front end, obviously know who I am. So prepared this statement, and the main purpose was from the original evidence, the revised zoning resulted in residential land being reduced by 7.5 hectares and replaced by commercial in that northeastern corner. And the following summary evidence just talks through if there's any effect on that from my original evidence presented. So
I'm not sure that I've got that to hand actually. Commissioner Dimmery, do you have that?
No, I don't. I do not.
no, look,
when we received it, or have we received it?
no,
I
it
just checked
hasn't
my
been.
email. I've got some things from some cases and Ms. Shaw's submissions, and I also have Fraser Campbell's
Yeah, that's
evidence.
right. So
I don't have
you're not
the
sure we've got
summary.
this yet?
No, I think the summary I've just got in my email a little while ago. So these, I don't think the summaries have been lodged with you, but
okay.
we can do that, but that's just been prepared over the weekend.
Oh,
You do have such rebuttal evidence as there is, and you do have the evidence in chief, of course.
Oh, I see.
Material. So this is just an aid memoir to
Yes.
speak to. But if you'd like them, we can certainly supply them.
It would be good, certainly very good to have it. Commissioner Dimmery, are you happy that we have it on screen and Mr. Bellingham runs through it like this, or would you prefer to have your own copy at the moment we can add our own notes to?
I'm happy to have it on screen if you are.
Yeah. Okay, let's do that for now, but it would be good to have a copy of this one and the others over lunch.
Could have the others circulated. So
Yeah.
for later in the day, we might add notes to them potentially.
Yeah, that would be good. That would be good.
I'll ask Mr. Bedham to do that.
Yeah. On the basis of the way I have my screen set up, and this is entirely just thinking about myself, of course. Are you able to make the size of that a touch larger? Yeah, perfect. That's it. It's only the fact that I have my screen cut in half with other things.
No, that's fine. Apologies for that.
Okay. Yeah. Thank you.
So do you want me to run through each of these, or?
I think if yeah, I can see it's 4 pages, but yeah, if you could please, I think, given we don't have it in front of us.
Cool. Okay. So in terms of earthworks across the site, the site historically has been majority completely earthworked, and there's existing geotechnical completion reports in place confirming that the ground is suitable for commercial structures. The change in the northeastern corner does not affect this previous evidence. The existing roading network, as you would have seen when you've been to site, it's very extensive, and in future with the residential development land use change, extensions and safety improvements that need to be made.
Sorry, Mr. Bellingham, I'm just going to interrupt. I can hear someone else has got a mic on in the background, which is coming through too. I think it's stopped now, so I don't think it's you. So please carry on now. I think that stopped. Thanks.
Okay. So paragraphs 7.1 to 7.4, the existing overland flow paths and flooding within the site have been addressed and mitigated via the underlying subdivision bulk earthworks completed. The proposed amendments in zoning within the northeastern corner have no effect upon this. So paragraphs 8.1 onwards talk to the wastewater of the site. So we've completed a capacity assessment of the internal wastewater networks on the site itself and the transmission line, and they have adequate capacity to service the proposed site and the change in land use. Chapter 8, or paragraph 8.2, sorry, and as noted previously, that the 42A report and subsequent update in zoning resulted in 7.5 hectares being removed from housing and reverting to commercial zoning. So the net effect of that on our overall wastewater generation was a reduction of about 0.8% to the PC 150 lane change area.
Could I come in with a question on that? From memory, looking at other evidence that we've had before us, is saying that the number of dwellings overall is unlikely to reduce because we're going from low density to medium density, so effectively the lot size halves, so you get the same number of dwellings in the same in less of an area. Does that not impact upon this? I would have expected that the wastewater figure would have been most influenced by the number of dwellings rather than site area.
Yeah, correct. And in our initial original evidence, we've assessed it, general residential and medium density, 300 and 400 square metre type sites. This area here was a mix of actually sort of large lots or reduced residential density, originally alongside State Highway 15. So what's happened is that has changed now to commercial zoning, which we have less wastewater production from that use. Because a lot of commercial activity is obviously your sheds, your ITMs, that sort of thing, are very little wastewater production. It's only, and if you're looking at once you get sort of industrial use or industries, then potentially you have a lot higher discharge. But a typical commercial development results in lesser flow as opposed to a residential house or dwelling.
But in terms of the fact that we've got less, we've got half the residential area, but apparently we're told the same number of residential units, would that the same number of residential units still not produce the same amount of wastewater as we had previously?
In terms of like straight numbers, so if we're talking, it's 0.8% less. So I guess it's more or less status quo, but it is slightly less than the original evidence.
Isn't that taking into account the commercial as well?
Yes, this is taking into account the reduction in residential and the replacement by commercial, this assessment. So this number is purely saying originally we had residential alongside State Highway 15. That's now been, as part of that 42A update, been replaced by commercial, and the net effect of that change was a slight reduction.
Is the flow from a residential dwelling will be less from a general residential dwelling than a large lot dwelling, will it then? Is that what you're saying?
No, we're not comparing different residential assumptions here. We're just literally comparing a change in land use. So originally when we assessed it as residential, and now it's changed to commercial. So all we're assessing is the change in areas and hectares between a residential use and a commercial use.
So you just look at solely areas.
Yeah.
But surely the wastewater produced must link directly to the number of dwellings that we have.
Correct. And if you can see in the table here, what we've done is we've listed, obviously medium density and general residential. So those are your different zones which we assessed originally. And what we've done is we've just updated the zoning. So we had general residential there previously, which is now changed to commercial.
So I just wonder whether Mr. Bedham might be able to help with this. My understanding, recollection, is that where we've got the change, the commercial zone, there's a net loss of 30 dwellings, I think, in total dwellings, and obviously an addition of commercial activities.
Yes. Yeah.
So it's not quite a one-for-one relationship with the assumption of the extension of the general residential zone over the low density stuff. We still end up, as I understand it, with a negative 30 dwellings. Now, perhaps, Mr. Bedham, am I correct in that?
Yeah, I was just going to point the commissioners to my rebuttal statement, 20th of October, page 4 and page 5, the bottom of page 4, 3.5C. I make a comment there about the size, and it's in a footnote actually on page 5, where I sort of outlay the calculation, and the net answer is that it's, I think I've characterised it as being neutral, but ultimately it looks like it's a reduction of about 30 residential allotments in terms of yield. So it's a marginal decrease, and I think that's borne out in Mr. Bellingham's numbers.
Okay, that makes sense. I thought we were closer than the 30 gap. No, okay, thank you.
Can I now continue with this? So we understand that it's roughly the same, the amount of wastewater generation, but what I'm not clear on is are there any differences in the characteristics of that wastewater generation? Because I understood from the infrastructure department evidence, I think it was Mr. Campbell, saying that there are diurnal peaks, and that makes quite a difference in terms of wastewater treatment capacity. The diurnal peaks of residential in comparison to the existing industrial zone, and I can't see where this is addressed. No, so whilst the quantity might be the same, the peaks are different.
Yeah, so I guess if you looked at what's happened in the 42A report, you would say that the peaks have been slightly reduced in terms of those flows, because obviously we've removed some of the housing, which denotes your great rated peak loads night and morning, when we all get up and we all go to sleep. And I guess one thing, if maybe I continue through my evidence, if that's all right. That sort of addresses, probably moves on to addressing a bit more around capacity of pump station and greater thoughts on those matters, because we do all realise there's capacity constraints.
Thank you.
So this is what we're saying here is that in terms of the wastewater generation from the subject site, and we're only talking about 0.8% here, so more or less status quo, the current wastewater generation from the plan change site is less than the status quo structural plan that's currently there. And a detailed assessment was completed in my initial evidence, where we ran 3 scenarios in there. There's a lot of, I guess there's a lot of numbers floating around on this parcel of land. There's been a lot of work done in the past, and one thing that we wanted to sort of highlight, which was followed on in paragraphs 8.3 to 4, is that we fully acknowledge, in reviewing the evidence of Fraser, of Mr. Campbell and Mr. Charles from WDC, there are constraints for the Ruakaka wastewater treatment plant, which requires progressively upgrading the service field development of the subject site and the wider development in Ruakaka. Ongoing discussions are required to facilitate treatment plant upgrade programs. The applicant acknowledges this, and from evidence of Mr. Charles, I understand that Council has identified and provided funding for a suite of projects over the next 10 years to provide additional network capacity. And I guess that's really the point that we wanted to highlight. We in no way, shape or form are saying there's not capacity issues, and we believe that there's ability currently within the TWMR3 of the recently operative 3 Waters Management Chapter to address these requirements at the time of subdivision development. So I guess from our end, we could get into a very technical discussion around wastewater flows and assessments, pre versus post, apples with apples or apples with bananas, because there are a lot of different numbers and factors used, and numerous parties have done assessments to this. When we summarise it all, though, we come back to, at the end of the day, where the wastewater is going to needs upgrades, and the ability to facilitate those upgrades is there. So I guess that's really to summarise the wastewater. We think in terms of plan change, it can be adequately dealt with, and in future resource consent applications, process can be managed by council and the subsequent upgrade of the plant as required implemented.
Mr. Bellingham, if this private plan change is approved and not appealed and consents are lodged next year to develop much of this residential, is there a point where the consents might be granted and the development built, but the wastewater capacity will not yet be there due to the significant lead time that's outlined in the evidence of the infrastructure department?
I believe council has full discretion under the current rules there to not approve this development if there wasn't sufficient capacity, or if, in my experience elsewhere in the country, a developer's agreement would be done with council to facilitate upgrades, and normally that's handled post plan change as part of the resource consent process directly with council. So there are options that would have to be undertaken to enable development to occur. But I guess fundamentally, if there's no capacity within the plant, council have the right to say there's no houses being built on the land.
And in your experience, have you provided design or technical advice on a wastewater treatment plant upgrade? And can you give us any indication of how long these things might take?
So I guess there's a couple of projects we're currently involved with. Both of them are Auckland based, one in Warkworth and one in Drury South. The Warkworth wastewater plant is upgrading significant. It's undergoing significant upgrades at Snells Beach currently. So I've been working with Watercare on 2 projects in the region and their procurement team around the upgrades. And I would have to double check, and I can come back later on the exact timing, but off the top of my head it's about 2 to 3 years. And the upgrade or the management of that has been the advancement of the project. There's obviously an interest cost to doing the advancement, which has been met by the private developer.
And what was the mechanism for that? Was it a developer funding agreement, as you've alluded to?
Yeah, as part of the resource consent, so post plan change.
So you're saying a resource consent required funding agreement?
So to get resource consent, we have to be able to prove that the site can be serviced and dispose of wastewater. So that was when the full-on discussions and agreements were undertaken. A private agreement reached between Watercare and the developer.
And what was the rough time frame for that?
In terms of the agreement,
Yes.
to be reached is about 6 months.
Right, and then perhaps another 2 to 3 years to design and build the
potentially.
Plant.
Yeah.
And more experience. Okay, yeah. Thank you.
I will, if everybody's happy, I'll move on to water and services.
I just wonder, Mr. Bellingham, if there's somebody close to you in your office, because there is a conversation that's coming through, and it might be on your speaker. I think if they might move to somewhere further away, that'd be possibly helpful.
Okay. Hang on a second. I will just see if I can.
Thanks.
Move them. Apologies. We've got our bubbles in action, but he's moving further apart. Is that okay at your end now?
It's better just at the moment, but the mic does seem to pick up voices from whatever distance they're away.
Okay.
Well, yeah. Unfortunately.
Okay. So I mean, water supply to the current development has adequate capacity to service from both potable and firefighting. And paragraphs 10.1 and 10.2, power and telecom networks are available within the site, and upgrades as required will be completed in parallel with future resource applications. So in conclusion, from my end, we, as noted previously, fully acknowledge the current constraints within the Ruakaka wastewater treatment plant, which applies to the whole of the Ruakaka Marsden Point catchment. In my view, Rule TWM-R3 provides sufficient scope for Council to consider the capacity of the network at the time of subdivision and development. With this in mind, I do not consider that any specific precinct controls related to wastewater specified by the INS Department evidence are necessary.
Commissioner Dimmery, any further questions from you?
Thank you. I just, back at the start, wanted to seek confirmation regarding your comments on the geotechnic work done previously, that you've confirmed it's suitable for commercial, and am I right to assume that that means it's most likely also suitable for residential? Yeah,
correct. We typically find that it's going to be more onerous for commercial structures. They're normally of sufficient sort of weight and bulk that's greater than a lightweight timber frame structure.
Thank you.
And nothing from me, because the only question I've noted in your evidence in chief was in relation to the wastewater issues that we've covered off. So no, that's good for me. So no more from us. Thank you.
Thank you.
Right.
Thank you, sir. The next witness is Matt Riley. He's out there. So he is.
Good morning, everybody.
And use the same process. I'm not sure, Mr. Riley, if you have a summary that's you're going to put on the screen.
Yes, I do. I'll just bring that up now.
And ideally, these will be coming through to you. Here's Mr. Bedham to tell us what's happening.
Just to interject, I do have them. I'm just waiting to get all of them in one place so I can send them to you in one go. But Mr. Riley's summary is part of that. I can send it through now, so you've got it. Or alternatively, in the next break, I'll send through all of them in one go.
I'm happy to continue as we are, I think, and have them all come through in one go, if that's okay. Otherwise, okay. I think I might make a mistake and not save something.
Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Well, I might just start off then, if it's okay. I've just got a kind of a quite brief summary of my evidence. To start off, recently you'll be aware there's been a proposal to remove the LDR zoning towards State Highway 15 and replace that with commercial and general residential zoning. That's in the rebuttal evidence of David Bedham. I've reviewed that change and consider from my point of view it doesn't raise urban design concerns. I've been involved, of course, in reviewing submissions and further submissions on the plan change. And in my view, having looked at those submissions and further submissions, none raise issues of direct relevance to an urban design assessment. In regard to the town centre itself, so that's placed at the northwest corner of the plan change area, as you're aware. Look, I consider that's well placed to serve the wider Marsden Point Ruakaka area. And I think it's good that in the town centre itself, there is an RD, resource consent process to assess new buildings. You know, we went through a process of looking, you know, as you do, whether it should go through an RD process or whether there was a rule-based system to go through. And there was a leaning towards that RD assessment process and having looks at the matters of discretion that's required there. I've got a view that as buildings developed within that centre over a time, council has sufficient discretion to ensure that there will be high amenity results achieved. Looking at the proposed roading network, as you'll be aware, the roading network as it exists at the moment, and as Mr. Bedham referred to, it's quite skeletal at the moment. That existing roading network was really designed to achieve, to work for an industrial land-based activities. So, you know, quite large blocks and wide roads, of course, to allow for, you know, trucks of some size to maneuver. So the proposed roading plan, which is within the plan change, in my view, has a good level of kind of a fine grain quality to it, and has worked with it in a way that retrofits that larger scale industrial sized roading network to that more mixed use purpose which the plan change is aimed at. As you'll be aware, around the periphery of the site, around One Tree Hill Road and State Highway 15 into the north, where the Kiwi Rail Future Rail line is, we now have proposed commercial zoning, and I consider that that's quite an effective buffer actually to residential uses in the site. And you know, I think that change from LDR towards the northeastern eastern end of the site, which previously required an acoustic bund buffer, that change to commercial zoning is a positive benefit in the sense that while you no longer need that buffer for directly adjacent residential uses, and you get the benefit of a slight distance and intermediary buildings, which commercial zone activities will form there, providing a buffer of sorts to the traffic volumes along those exterior roads to the plan change area. The next point is point 6 there. And this is something that we looked at in a fair level of detail. So we've introduced a requirement for a 2-metre deep landscape buffer, along with plants and trees for commercial and mixed use zone sites adjoining One Tree Hill Road and State Highway 15. And that's just for your reference, sub precincts B, E, and F, if I've got those numbered according to the right current sub precincts. And that, in my view, assists in managing views from these roads, these kind of major entry roads up into Whangarei to the backs of the buildings. Because of course in the commercial and mixed use zones, resource consent is not required for an RD process, you know, for new building construction if you comply with the standards. So in a sense, there's no design-based criteria or rules really to ensure that you get positive fronts back to those major exterior roads. And in my view, having looked at the layout of the site, the natural inclination of developers who will develop on those particular periphery commercial and mixed use zones will be to face inwards into the plan change area rather than outwards. So their fronts effectively will be towards the inside of the plan change area to the internal roads rather than fronting to the exterior roads. And what that means as a default is you get building backs, I guess, to those exterior road frontages. So we were looking from an amenity perspective really, and from a wider sense as you enter into Whangarei, what's a rational and relatively pragmatic solution to get an attractive entry point coming in as you enter the wider Whangarei area. Point 7, there is, I've in my evidence and in my original reporting on the plan changed, I did identify a number of characteristics of this particular site that are slightly different from how, for example, the commercial zone and mixed use zone is applied more generally in Whangarei, which I felt were different for this area. And so there are some modifications proposed to those underlying zones to recognise those characteristics, and that's really kind of the interface kind of conditions, I guess. So Mr. Bedham will be speaking to those more in his rebuttal, I'm aware of, but I'm available to answer questions on those too if you would like. Moving to my final point there, point 8. So overall, having looked at the proposed plan change provisions and having been involved over time to those changing provisions and to the sub-precincts and zoning as it's now proposed, I consider that the spatial arrangement that is proposed along with the future proposed road network will allow Marsden City to develop as a compact and connected new urban area, consistent with the general model of a compact city, which is encouraged by the Whangarei District Plan and will result in overall good urban design outcomes. just close that page there if you're comfortable with that.
Yep, thank you. Commissioner Dimmery, any questions?
Thank you. Sorry, I'll just get organised. I did have some questions, just generally thinking about the pros and cons of interface controls between different zones.
Yes.
And whether you could give some commentary on whether where zones are divided by a road or as opposed to mid-block. So if you look at up at the commercial area in the northeast, because we don't have dimensions here at the moment, there could be more roads going through there. Whereas if you look in the southern part, there's commercial on the southern side of the road and then residential opposite. And I wondered if you could give us your view on the pros and cons, if you like, of zoning being mid-block or separated by a road.
Well, it's an interesting one over time, and I think a number of us have been involved in various councils through reviews of our district plans and encountered this very question as to whether you change zones across the road or whether you change zones kind of mid-block. Often it's regarded to be a good idea to actually change zones in a way mid-block, if only because you can then get complementary built form across both sides of a road. So that's kind of one way of looking at zoning changes, or zoning interfaces. Another way of looking at zoning interfaces is well, across the width of a road, that the width of a road itself can accommodate those built form and use changes. And that can come down to looking at aspects, for example, about how wide the road is, the heights enabled within the different land use zones on different sides of the road. And if those aren't adequate, you may look at mitigation or further amenity mitigation techniques such as landscaping and those sort of elements. So in my view, I think my view over this has changed a bit over time. I don't think it's necessarily clear cut. I think either method can work. It's just a matter of looking at, well, those combination of outcomes, built form outcomes, widths of roads, and then perhaps, for example, mitigation or front yard treatments that can assist in doing transition. And that's the case, for example, if perhaps those transitions might be seen to be somewhat abrupt. And in my view, looking at the zonings that we've got, I don't think in this area, well, in this plan change, for example, we don't have, for example, the light industry zone or the heavy industry zone. We have the commercial zone, which of course, it's a reasonably broad zone in terms of the land uses it enables. But I think there's a relatively comfortable transition in terms of those uses it enables and the bulk and scale of those buildings it allows for across two residential uses. So does that kind of answer your question? I'm not sure if I've necessarily targeted your question.
No, it's helpful. So no, that is helpful. So the follow-up to that is, I know this isn't a resource consent.
Yes.
And obviously there's many different layouts that could develop over time.
Yes.
But I'm wondering whether you've tested that commercial area in the north, that north of Casey Road, to look at how that development may build out, and that I don't know what the width of that land is, and whether if it was a mid-block transition with the residential, is there a possibility you get quite tall tilt-up slab walls right on the boundary with the residential and at that interface, and is any control needed there?
Well, I think your earlier question was actually, you know, you weren't quite clear as to whether there might be a road along and through that area. I don't quite remember I think it's Appendix D in the plan change, which shows a proposed roading network. If we were to have a look at that, and apologies, I actually don't have that in front of me.
If I may, would it assist
I do have it, and
you do.
If I shared it on the screen so you can see it, I've got it.
That would be helpful.
Thank you. Yeah, that'd be good.
So that's exactly my question. That is just one possibility that you could. It shows an indicative road through there, but of course there's nothing to require that. And so if there wasn't a road there, the built form outcome could be quite different. And are you satisfied from a design perspective and for some reason, I don't know, there were shared driveways or something serving that area along the railway designation instead, are you satisfied that the interface between the residential and commercial will be appropriate from a design perspective?
I might need Mr. Bedham's assistance in this regard, but I do recall from the commercial zone rules, I understand that I think it's the majority of activities require a landscaping buffer where they adjoin residential uses. And from recollection, that's a 1.8. Oh, sorry, it's certainly it's landscaping that must be able to achieve a height of 1.8 meters. So there is some element of mitigation or that transition kind of built into those zone that zone interface kind of condition. I guess I had, when I was looking at this, presumed that indeed that you would get a road in this area kind of coming through on this alignment, but that's a good point that you make, that it is shown to be indicative.
Okay. Thank you.
Just noticed a hand up from Mr. Burgoyne, sorry, in the background.
Oh, Mr. Burgoyne.
Yeah, sorry, just jumping in on that point, with the commercial zone, there are also other instances throughout the rest of the district where there is that same interface of commercial zone and general res, or even medium density, I think, in some places. And there are, besides the provisions that Mr. Riley referred to, there's also specific setback and height and relation boundary controls that apply where commercial zone is abutting GRZ. And then there's specific policies too that talk about managing that cross-zone boundary effect. So there are other provisions in place to look at those effects.
And are they proposed in the section 42A recommendation? Or are we just relying on the fact they're in the zones?
Yes, yeah, and I believe that based on the recent amendments from the Kaingora consent order and track changes, it's basically saying rely on those existing underlying commercial zone provisions to, just stay in place and manage this sort of cross the zone boundary issues.
Thank you.
Anything else from you, Commissioner Dimry?
Yes, sorry, I'm just having a wee scroll.
No, that's fine. No.
Mr. Riley, one of the themes that comes through in the evidence is that there's a need to retrofit the roads throughout, and you've touched on in your summary that they're wide industrial roads. And I'm wondering if you can tell us, in your experience, have you dealt with a case like this? It is very unusual having a vacant lot industrial zone subdivision that hasn't been built out. It's already subdivided with multiple landowners. And have you have experience and mechanisms and to deliver the street network and typologies that you're proposing in your evidence, how this was delivered in reality, where there might be multiple parties applying for one quite small development at a time of, say, a site of 5,000 square metres, and how do you deliver the the roads as intended in a comprehensive basis, because clearly it would seem you can't just do one can't do the piece of road in front of one's property piecemeal. So how do we comprehensively achieve this retrofit that you're recommending?
I think that's a really good question, and I wish I had a clear answer for that. In my experience, it tends to be messy no matter what you do. And I've seen kind of two approaches used. One is when you're talking about future finer scale road networks, not to reference, for example, any indicative roading network at that scale at all in a diagrammatical form. Another method is to do what has been done in this plan change, and that builds on what came through in original reporting by Harrison Grierson on the urban design aspects of this proposal to show an indicative future roading network. I think the advantage here is, certainly at this stage, is that we have two major landowners. My understanding is there are other landowners, I understand as well, but we have two major landowners. So from a pragmatic point of view, I'd suggest, and from my experience, that does make things somewhat easier, and that you're dealing with less number of parties. To achieve that finer scale network over time.
I just wonder if it's worthwhile, and it might be Mr. Bedham who's best placed to show this, to identify in general terms where the landownings sit, because I mean, that point raised by Mr. Riley is a critical part of why we're doing what we're doing. It has got.
Is Mr. Bedham able to do that on the indicative roading plan that we had a minute ago? Be really good.
Okay, bear with me. I'll just bring up. So you want me to bring up the indicative roading plan that I just set up?
Yeah, and perhaps point that as best you can virtually.
Okay, I will do. Bear with me, please. So this is the indicative roading plan that we have in Appendix C, and in terms of land ownership. This line, can you see my cursor?
Yes.
Yeah.
This line here, essentially south of that, the predominant landowner is GNLC and Bream Bay Retirement Village, which is in here. So they're the predominant landowner south of this land, of this line. North of this line, the predominant landowner is Marsden City Limited Partnerships, is the applicant. So again, I wouldn't want to say I'm accurate in my figures, but I'd say that Marsden City Limited Partnership is approximately 50% of the overall land area, and I'd say GNLC might be 25 to 30%, and then you have a number of other smaller individual land holdings scattered throughout the site which have already been sold. But by far and away, as Mr. Riley highlights, the vast land holding is owned by MCLP and GNLC Limited.
Could you just confirm for me, because the legend, the key is very small when it's displayed on my monitor here. The larger dashed line, it says new residential street, is that correct?
So do you mean this one here, upgraded residential street?
No, the one below it says new residential street.
Yes.
But it doesn't say indicative. So what's the difference between an indicative residential street, which is the dots below, and a new residential street, which is dashed?
So the intention there is for those streets to be more, or the location of those roads to be more fixed. In terms of the indicative residential streets, they're shown on there, but they could change depending on the scale and nature of development.
So, and could you just remind me? Sorry, Mr. Riley, we're sort of hijacking your moment.
No, please do.
So can you just remind me in terms of what the rules say in terms of the provision of the new residential streets versus indicative? In general terms, not necessarily exactly.
I'll take you to the rule. It's probably going to be easier.
Yeah. Okay.
To see the rule. It's where are we? It's this rule here. Cool. So can everyone see that?
Yeah.
So it says, well, it's permitted if street cycleways and footpaths, excluding those connections provided within vested open space areas. That was based on a submission from Infrastructure and Services, which was accepted, and located in accordance with the plan. Actually, so the plan is the one attached and formed in accordance with the street section plan. So we have a number of cross sections as well after the overlying street network plan. Where it's not achieved, it's restricted discretionary activity.
But there's no requirement to provide it. It's not
No.
that, this is where I read it. There's no specific requirement to provide that street, is there?
Well, it's a consenting framework. So if you didn't provide them, then you would go into a restricted discretionary framework, and you need to apply for consent. So it is a requirement in the sense that if you don't want to apply for consent for it, you do. But as is the case with these things, a consenting framework is in place. If you were to come up with something different based on the nature of development, you could, but essentially you would have to apply for consent, and the basis of the assessment is to look at that plan, but there's also an information requirement in the MCP REQ too.
I have a lot of questions about how this will work, but I'm conscious that these are planning questions, not urban design questions.
Yeah, that's right, because I also upgrade to existing
Okay.
streets as well. I mean, I think they're things that I think have arisen from an urban design perspective, and I think from what I hear, Mr. Riley is supportive of the plan that we saw a moment ago with the indicative street network. But it's the practicalities of making that happen, I guess, which comes back to a question for you later, Mr. Bedham. So probably we're putting you on notice rather than necessarily continuing now. Do you think, Commissioner Dimmery?
Yes, I was just simply trying to understand if Mr. Riley himself had experience in this similar situation and the effectiveness of getting this delivered on the ground, because I'm conscious that he may have advised on other developments and may have something to add to the discussion, but I know what we really want to get to the root of is the planning techniques, which is outside of Mr. Riley's domain. No, that's fine.
Perhaps having...
Sorry, Mr. Allen.
I was just going to say, perhaps if Mr. Riley is around or stays on the call, obviously, and on the hearing, when we come to Mr. Bedham's presentation, if you have questions that then flow back from Mr. Bedham's technical issues to Mr. Riley, he can answer those at that point too. It might be an efficient way to make sure that both angles are explored.
Yes, yeah, thank you.
Thank you. I had a question here and I can't recall whose evidence it came from. It was regarding the permitted status for ground floor residential in a sub-precinct.
Was that the mixed use zone? It might have been, sorry to interrupt.
Yeah, it's at the 9.9. So yes, it is the mixed use zone. So Ms. Ryan, sorry, I'm just skimming it. So you've said that resource consents can be applied for residential at ground floor.
Yes.
I was just wondering if, from a design perspective, you had any comment on whether sometimes controls such as a half level up can be a better outcome for residential at ground floor, or are you satisfied you could just deal with this through a resource consent?
Holistically, I think in mixed use areas, if the provision framework is largely permitted, as it is in this mixed use zone, new buildings don't require consent generally if they comply with development standards or controls, then I think it's difficult to adequately control the outcomes of the mix of ground floor commercial business activities with possibly adjoining ground floor residential activities. Those activities can combine and be adjacent at ground floor and adjoining sites and adjoining buildings, but it's a bit of a challenge. And I think it's more of a challenge to do that through trying to come up with a permitted framework which might have development controls or standards to adequately control those outcomes. And Commissioner, you just spoke about one method or outcome that's often thought to be good is for a ground floor residential activity in that situation to have a raised threshold, and that's a good outcome. But that's just one of a few outcomes. One way of managing a residential at ground floor where there's an adjoining possible business activity. So I think it would be too restrictive to apply to have a rule that necessarily required that, because it may not be applicable in every situation. There could be different ways to do it. So my preference would be, well, my recommendation would be that that residential at ground floor is through a consenting framework, that you require consent for it, and that enables you to look at that site, that street, the potentially adjoining businesses and uses, and go, well, what does work here from an amenity perspective?
Thank you. Yeah, no, thank you. I did have a question here about whether it was a better urban design outcome for the link roads to connect to Waiwara Drive, but I'm not quite sure what I was referring to. Sorry, it's a while since I've looked at these notes.
Oh, I think I might know what you mean. Is that to do with, if I just prompt your memory, if I'm on the right track, is that where perhaps stage 2 of the retirement village is? And
yes, that's correct.
Right. Yes. Yeah. Interesting. And I looked at that with the